Let's look at how we can incorporate a carousel plugin into our project. A carousel is one of the most popular UI components in modern web design. A carousel allows you to present your favorite images, products, blog posts, or any other content in an infinite rotating interface. You may be wondering what's the difference between a carousel and a slider. In general, a carousel allows the visitor to infinitely loop through carousel items by clicking or tapping the navigation controls or by swiping on the screen in cases of mobile use. It means that the carousel will automatically go back to the first item when you reach the last one and continue to navigate in this way. This is opposed to a slider, which usually stops running when you reach the last slide. We're going to look at how we can incorporate a carousel into a web page. I'm going to use a plugin to make this process a little bit easier. We're going to look at how we can create carousels using a plugin. We'll be using the same plugin to create 3 different types of carousels. The first carousel is going to function like this, where it's going to display all of my images and I'll have the ability to navigate through the images. You'll notice as I navigate, the image in the middle is going to be 100% opacity and in focus, while the other images are going to be slightly dimmed out. I can navigate through the carousel by using the little dots or by using the next and previous links. The second example of our carousel that we're going to look at is a carousel that automatically cycles through the images. I am not doing anything on the page, and as you can see, the images are changing. In addition to the images changing, the indicator link is going to also change. And then I have the ability to manually override and go ahead and navigate through the images in this way as well. Our final carousel example is going to be slightly different. This one is going to show a series of images, and I've added some text just to show you that it doesn't have to just be images. You can really put any sort of item within the carousel. This one's different because when I click my next or previous buttons, it's going to cycle through several images instead of just cycling through one. So when I click this, it's going to actually move all 3 images over at the same time. The same thing will happen if we use our little indicator links down below. Let's go ahead and see how we can build out this sort of functionality using a jQuery plugin. The first step when you decide to use a plugin is to find the right plugin. Honestly, this can take a little bit of time. You might have to try a couple of different ones before you find the right one. The plugin that we're going to use for our carousel is called Slick. This is the landing page for the Slick plugin, and this is going to tell me some of the features. It will also give me demonstrations of what the plugin is going to look like and give me some code so I have an idea of what I'll need to incorporate in order to add this sort of functionality to my page. This plugin has a wide variety of edits that you can make in order to customize the carousel experience. In all honesty, this plugin page is pretty explanatory in regards to what you can actually do with the plugin. Since the plugins are usually created by individuals and not a specific jQuery company, the documentation varies quite a bit. So sometimes you'll have to dig in and really experiment to see how the plugin may work. If I continue to scroll down on this page, I'll get to a Getting Started section. This will give me an idea of the type of HTML and the necessary dependencies that I might need in order to use this particular plugin. It's also going to tell me how I can begin using the plugin. In addition, it has a bunch of different settings. The settings will allow me to make changes to how the plugin behaves on the page. And as I showed you in my demonstration, I'm using the same plugin, but I'm getting very different results. The behavior that I'm seeing are a result of the different types of settings that you can modify on the plugin. The final thing that you'll need to do is you'll need to download the plugin. For this particular plugin, you can use the Get It Now navigational link, or you can click Download Now. If you click this link, you're going to end up downloading a folder. The folder is going to contain a series of files, and you will need to read through the documentation so that you'll be able to figure out which files are the ones that you need. Oftentimes, the downloads will have demo files, so if you're stuck, looking at the demo file is always a good way to go. Since this plugin is pretty well documented, we can actually read through the instructions and figure out the files that we'll need in order to incorporate this into our project. I'm going to go ahead and build out this page with you so that I can show you how to use the particular files. I do want to point out that I have moved some of these files into my folder directory so that they're ready for me to use. All of the files that we're going to be using, in addition to some that we don't need, are located in this slick folder. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've copied the slick.css, the slick theme.css, along with the fonts folder and this GIF file. The GIF file is being used for the loader and the fonts files are being used for the navigational elements. In addition, I've copied over the slick.min.js file, which is the minified version of this particular plugin. The other files that I have in my directory are my images, and I'm going to be using these as I build out this particular carousel. Here's the page that I'm starting with, and it's just going to contain images that I've placed on the page. Let's look at the code that I have thus far. Here's the HTML page that I'm using so far. We'll just start by building out the first example, and then we'll add some code so that we can build out the additional examples. I've made a div with a class of carousel, and then I've placed the images inside the div, and that's pretty much it for the HTML. It's also worth noting that I've linked out to the jQuery library, and I'm doing this at the bottom of my page, and I also have a script tag that just has the document ready function. In regards to the CSS, I'm using my reset.css file along with a style.css. My style.css really is not adding anything in regards to the slick carousel. They're just some general rules that I'm using on the body, on some of my font elements, and I have a rule that ensures that my images are responsive. Let's get started adding the carousel. The very first thing that I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to add links out to the plugins CSS files. So I downloaded two of the CSS files from the plugin, slick.css and slicktheme.css. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to load these before my styles. The reason why is because I might want to override some of the styles that have been provided to me. So I'll have my styles appear after the plugin styles in case I want to override them. I'm going to go ahead and use the link element to link to the slick.css file along with the slick-theme.css file. If we save the page and we refresh, you won't notice any difference yet. These two CSS files are going to be dependencies for the actual plugin. So none of the styles are going to work until we start using the plugin. The next thing that we need to do is we need to pull in the link to the slick.javascript file. I'm going to do that down here, right underneath my link to the jQuery library. I'll make a new script tag, and then we'll use our source attribute, and we'll point to our scripts folder and pull in the slick.min.js file. Now I have all the dependencies linked up. So the next step is for me to be able to make the actual code to call the slick method and then apply any sorts of settings that I want to use to modify the slideshow. Let's look at how we can do that. If you check the Slick website and go down to the Getting Started section, you'll notice that it tells you what you need to do in order to get the script working. Inside the document ready function, you're going to go ahead and select your class. In my case, that's carousel. Then you're going to use the slick method. And then inside the curly braces, you're going to set up a series of property values that are going to modify the slideshow in some way. Now, before we go ahead and get started with our code, I do want to show you in the downloaded slick file, there is an index.html file. If you open up this file in the browser, you're going to see that it displays a page that shows different versions of how you can have your slideshow display. These are examples of methods in which you can display the slideshow. So there's all sorts of different ways that you can show your slideshow. This is a great starting point, especially if you're not sure on how to use the code. As I mentioned, the documentation is pretty good and there is a lot of information, but it can still be a little bit cryptic, especially if you're new to this. So a good tip is to dissect the provided demonstration files, if there are any, so you can see how you want something working. This slideshow right here is fairly close to what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open this file and see what kind of code they're using for this particular slideshow. I'll grab this index file and open it in my editor. If we look through the file, you'll find that there is some CSS that's been applied to some of these elements. This may be helpful to us as we move through doing this exercise. In addition, you're going to find the different sorts of demonstration files that are available. So if you want to find a particular slideshow, you're going to need to find which one that is. Since there are a lot in this example, I find that if you right-click and inspect on the element, it might be easier for you to go ahead and figure out what the class name is on that particular element. So this one is called regular slider. So if we look down here, here is the regular slider section. And then if you scroll further down on the page, you're going to see the JavaScript that was used. So if we look for the selector called a regular, this is the code that's being used for this particular interface. So let's go ahead and just copy this code. Then I'll go back to my file, and inside the document ready function, I'm going to paste in this code. Now my selector has a different name, so I need to update this with the name that I chose, which in my case is called carousel. Then we're going to use the .slick method. We'll open the parentheses, and in the curly braces, we're going to place this code. So if we go ahead and we save this code, and we go back to our file and refresh, you will see that we do get a little bit of a slideshow. Now this isn't perfect yet, but it is functioning. So what we need to do is we need to figure out how we can get the next and previous indicators, which actually are here. We just can't see them right now because they're white. And we probably want to create some spacing between these elements. As I mentioned, you may need to play around and experiment with some of these settings and tweak this until you get the correct settings. So right now my slideshow is scrolling 3 slides. I only want this particular slideshow to scroll 1 slide at a time. So I'm going to modify the value right here and change this to 1. If we save now and we refresh, you will see that when I click on any of these links, it now only moves 1 slide at a time. The next thing that I'm going to add is I'm going to add another property called center mode. These properties are case sensitive, so you need to make sure that you're typing them in the right way. We're going to set center mode to true. When I refresh my page, you're going to see that this has been modified more. Now we see 3 full images and a partial of any image that's on either edge of our carousel. Now, in order to get these elements to appear more like this demonstration, we're going to have to incorporate some CSS. As I mentioned before, if you feel comfortable with CSS and the developer tools, you can right-click and you can fish on the various elements and see what CSS is being applied, and then you can experiment with different CSS. In order to get a jump start on this, I'm going to go into the example file that was provided to me, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to the CSS that they are using. There's quite a bit of CSS, and we might not need all of this, but I am going to go ahead and copy these rules right here. Now what I'll do is I'll go into my CSS file, and I'm going to just make a comment that this is the slick carousel CSS. Then I'll paste in the rules that I picked up from that file, and we'll save, and let's refresh our page. As you can see, this gets me much closer to what I wanted. This is almost exactly how I wanted my slideshow to work. The focused slide is appearing in the center. It has 100% opacity. The other elements are dimmed out, and as I use the navigator elements right here, you can see that the focus is always going to be in the middle slide and all the rest will be dimmed. This is a nice effect because it really draws your attention to the slide that is in the center. You can still see the other slides, but they're not taking up quite as much visual presence. I'm going to make a couple of other adjustments to this file. What I'd like to do is I'd like to adjust the position of the next and the previous buttons. I feel that they're just too close to the edges of my page. I'd like to scoot them in a little bit. In order to make this change, I'm going to need to figure out what CSS is controlling these elements. So I'm going to use my select element. I'll select one of these items, and you may need to experiment and click through the DOM until you can find the element that is controlling the position. Right now, I'm selecting the pseudo class of before. This is controlling the color of these elements, but there doesn't seem to be anything that is controlling their position. If I go up to the next element, you can see that this is the button, and I have something called slick-prev, and this seems to be controlling the position of this element. So if we change this position to something else, you can see how I'm able to move that previous button. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use this selector. I'll put this right here in my CSS, and we'll specify that we want the left position property to be set to 15 pixels. I'm willing to bet that there's something similar that's controlling the next button over here. So again, if I find that element, I can see what the selector is and what the property is. If you want to make changes right here in the developer tools, you can select on the value and then augment those values and see how that change is going to update. If I save with these changes and refresh, you can see how my next and previous buttons have been repositioned. There's a little bit more space on the right and the left edge, and I like that much more. The other change that I'd like to make is I'd like these little dots to appear slightly larger. So once again, I'm going to use my select element in the developer tools, and I'm going to find out what the selector is for those particular elements. Once we've clicked on these elements, you can see that these are the rules that are affecting it. There is something that is specifying the font size as 6. So if I start to increase the font size, you can see how these dots get larger. This is my selector. So I'm going to go ahead and select the name. I'll copy this. We'll go into our CSS. I'm going to paste this in, and then I'm simply going to set the font size to a larger size. Let's set this to 10 pixels. If we save and we refresh, you can see that these dots are a little bit bigger, which makes them easier to click. Now I have this first slideshow pretty much dialed in. I've customized the CSS, and I've been able to add the jQuery in order for this slideshow to appear in this particular manner. Let's move on to the next slideshow that I have on my page. I'll close the developer tools for now. I'm going to open this commented code in my HTML, and then I'll uncomment out this block of code. This block of code is similar, except this time I'm using a section element. It has a class of crossfade, and it contains several images. What we're going to do in order to target this particular slideshow is we need to select this slideshow. This slideshow is going to automatically play, and it's only going to show one image at a time. I know what the code is because I read through the documentation, and there is an example of something similar to this in the documentation. I'm going to want this slideshow to automatically play. I just don't want 3 slides to show. I only want 1. So this code is going to be fairly similar to what I need. I'll just copy this as a starting point. I'm going to go into my script tag, and we'll go ahead and create some space. I'll paste in the code, and I'm just going to indent this to make it easier to read. The first thing I need to do is I need to change my selector. The selector name that I'm using is called crossfade. And then we're going to go ahead and add the slick method. I want the slides to show to be set to 1, and slides to scroll, we could just leave that at 1 for now. I do want autoplay to be true. The autoplay speed is going to control how long the elements are going to sit on the page. And I've also spent a little bit of time looking through the documentation, so I'm combining this autoplay with this fade feature right here, which kind of cross fades in these elements. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of this code as well. I'll just copy this. We'll come into our code and I'm going to paste this in, and let's just clean up the indentation. And I don't think I actually need either of these property values, so I'm just going to get rid of those. We'll have autoplay set to true. We're going to go ahead and have the autoplay speed be 2000. I want the dots to be present so the user can navigate through the slideshow if they want. Infinite is just going to indicate that the slideshow will infinitely play. Speed has to do with the crossfade time. When the images crossfade into each other, they do that in about half a second. 500 stands for milliseconds. I want fade to be happening, so that's set to true. And I'm going to use the CSS ease property of linear. Let's save this and see how this affects our document. If we go back to our image carousel and if I refresh, you can now see that I have one large image. And if we sit on the page, in about 2 seconds, the image is going to crossfade into a new image. As you can see, this is auto playing. I'm not clicking any of the buttons, it simply is playing, which is exactly what we want. In addition to having this auto play, we can use the next and previous buttons to scroll manually through our slideshow. Once we do that, the autoplay functionality no longer works. So in this way, you can have something play and you can offer the user controls so that they can stop it from playing as well. In order to create a little bit more space between my slideshows, I'm going to go into my CSS file. I'm going to make a selector for slick-dotted.slick-slider, and we're going to set our margin bottom to 80 pixels. This should create some more space between the slideshows. So you can see that just separates them out a little bit. Now I'll go back into my index.html and I'm going to uncomment out my last block of code. This block of code is just going to show you that you can use slideshow elements that aren't just images. This one is going to contain figure elements, and within the figure I have images and fig captions. You can see that I'm using a class of multi for this particular slideshow. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come down and I'll use my jQuery selector. I'll select the multi element. I'll add the slick method to this element and then open my parentheses and curly braces. And inside the curly braces, I'm going to add the controls that I want. For this particular slideshow, I want my dots to be showing, so we'll set that to true. Then I'm going to pick the number of slides that I want to show. And for this carousel, I'm going to show 3 slides. I'm going to set slides to scroll to 3 as well. And then we're going to turn off center mode by setting center mode to false. Let's save this and let's refresh in the browser. Now, when I refresh, I notice that I just see one big element. If I come back to my code, I wrote slide to show. This actually should be slides to show. So let me save that and I'll refresh one more time. Now you can see on the bottom slideshow, we see 3 images. They do display the image and the fig caption. And if I use the navigator elements, it's going to slide or display 3 of these at once. The final thing I want to do on this last slideshow is I don't want these elements to be dimmed at all. So in order to fix that, we're going to go ahead and add a little bit of CSS. Once again, if you aren't sure what the selector is, open up your developer tools and then select the elements and figure out what the name of that particular class is going to be. The property that is forcing these elements to be dimmed is this one right here, slick-active. I want this to be set to 1 so that I can make these appear at full opacity. I only want to do this on this last slideshow, so I'm going to use a group selector so that I can target just the elements in this slideshow. We'll go into our style file, and I'm going to make a rule for this particular behavior. My selector is going to be .multi space .slick-slide, and then I'll go ahead and set the opacity to 1. If we save and we refresh, you'll now see that this last slideshow is going to display all 3 images at full opacity. When I use the navigator elements, the images are going to move 3 at a time. As you can see, with this particular plugin, there's all sorts of ways in which you can create these carousel type components. Normally, you would not have 3 carousel components on one page, but it is possible to do so by simply using different classes and then placing the code in. The more you practice using these sorts of plugins, the more comfortable you'll feel. You can definitely get very creative, and you can use your CSS to really customize and dial in the look and feel of the slideshows. And there you have it. I've built 3 different slideshows using the exact same plugin. We've modified some of the CSS and modified some of the jQuery so that we can make these behave in a different way. It might take you a little bit of work to figure out how the plugins function, but once you get that under your belt, you will have an excellent and easy to use tool to really enhance your websites.